I'm the chairman of the Scientific Medical Network, and it's my great honor to welcome you to Beyond the Brain 2020 and the Saturday session. So I'm chairing this morning, so please do get involved, do chat, do send questions, do send any thoughts or any links into the chat, and then we'll end up with a very rich and diverse session with your involvement too. So it's my great honor to involve and to welcome David Lorimer, who's our first speaker. And of course, David doesn't really need any introduction. David's been involved in all of our conferences really since the beginning. So anyway, welcome David. And as David says in his CV, he's a writer, lecturer, poet and editor, and also the founder of Character Education Scotland. The important thing is he's our program director, and he's been doing an absolutely brilliant job with that and has really helped with our transition as we've entered COVID from March time, and we've had to move away from real face-to-face conferences and meetings, which has been, of course, such a shame because that's so central to network. But instead, we have embraced virtual conferences and virtual meetings. And so we will do our best to be as inclusive and networking as possible through that. And through David as our program director, we have weekly webinars of really great speakers organized right through, I think, until sometime like March, David, isn't it?
No, we're into June now.
We're into June. I'm a couple of months behind. So I think we've got something of real quality every week for you. And that's only the, if you like, the headline webinar, because we do have a lot of other events as well for members only. And I have a few minutes, 10 minutes to talk about that a little bit later. So anyway, to get back to David, and again, welcome to David. Of course, most of you know him because he's our editor of Paradigm Explorer since 1986. And we had our 100th issue in 2019. He's, as you know, been central with so many of our conferences, including Beyond the Brain from 1995. And our other major conference that we have around April time is Mystics and Scientists. And you've been involved in that, haven't you, David, since the 1980s? Originally a merchant banker, then a teacher of philosophy and modern languages at Winchester College, etc., and author of over a dozen books. So the other aspect I think everyone knows about David is he's so incredibly well written. Sorry, well read, I should have said. So founding member of International Futures Forum and editor of its digest, etc., etc. And there's lots of other things I could say. He's also chair of the network's Galileo Commission. And I'm sure we'll be saying more about the Galileo Commission, which is one of our major projects. And that really is such an important thing. And I'm hoping that you've all looked at the Galileo website. And in 2020, he was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award as a visionary leader by the Visionaries International Network. So well done, David. So that leaves you to give us our morning session without further ado. Are you happy to talk and introduce the subject yourself, David?
Yes, indeed. Sorry, my shutter's just started banging, but I think it'll be all right. I don't think it'll move.
Okay, well, if there's any problems.
Yes, no, I'll share my screen. Thank you so much, Paul.
Okay, David, over to you.
So I'm going to share my screen, and why is that? Let me just go back into normally when you're sharing the screen, the thing that you've got comes up first, but in this case it hasn't. Now, here we go. Share. Oh.
We've got your emails, David.
Yeah, so I know. Well, I'm trying
Window.
to get into Zoom. Here we go. Sorry. Let's go back there and slideshow from beginning. Play from current slide. Good. Right. Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone, from the southwest of France. Very, very windy here. I don't know what's doing with you. So I'm going to be talking this morning about gnosis in a future science of consciousness. And what you'll find is that my talk will have some overlap and relationship with Tim Freak, who's following us. I've got this odd thing that happens that I lose my mouse, so I can't see.
Sorry, David.
Yes. Yeah.
We can still see your emails.
Can you?
Yes. So I think you need to just come out of screen share and then go back into share and select your presentation.
I mean, you can't see my presentation.
No,
not yet.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, it tells me that I'm actually not in. Okay, stop share.
Yeah.
Okay.
So stop share, and then if you go back into share and just make sure you select the presentation.
Yes. Right. And which is now the top thing. Share. How about that?
That's it.
That's it.
Perfect.
Good. Yep. Okay. Looking good.
Play from current slide. Right. Okay. Take two.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
So I'm going to talk about the gnosis in a future science of consciousness, and gnosis I think is something that we've rather forgotten about, although it's coming back in popularity. And my first slide here is to do with this extraordinary book called Catafalque by Peter Kingsley, which I reviewed last summer. It's a book where there's nearly 1,000 pages of text, 800 pages of text, and volume 2 is just the references and bibliography. It's really quite extraordinary. And what he insists, and this is something that he's insisted on in all his work, and that's Peter Kingsley, is that the origins of philosophy lie in the sacred, in mysticism, in initiation, in gnosis. And he works particularly on Parmenides and Empedocles, the pre-Socratic philosophers. And he says that philosophy, logic, science, even the apparent arts of reason, all have their origin in the experience of another world, which is a strong and quite controversial statement for our current Western understanding. And he says there's no true philosophy which does not reach completion in a metaphysic of ecstasy, no mystical experience which does not demand serious philosophical preparation. And such precisely was the dawning wisdom. And that's from Henri Corbin, who is quoted in the book. And this also applies to our honorary member, Professor Syed Hossein Nasser, when he talks about the knowledge and the sacred, where that sacred knowledge is also an experience of bliss, being, consciousness, bliss. And he says that his duty is to shock people into an awareness that all life comes from and returns to the sacred, which is also the message of indigenous peoples, and indeed the message of the Prince of Wales. So this is a slide where I talk a little bit about what I call the Gnostic fall in the cosmic game, which is a progressive awakening to our true nature. And this is something which Tim, I think, will also refer to later. And you can see in column 1, you've got as it were, the prior state, or the state in which we find ourselves. And in column 2, you've got the state to which we aspire. So from separation, density, and polarity to unity and wholeness. And the process of emanation from the one, from the center, the unfolding, the explication, is one direction. And then the return direction, which I feel this is the deep meaning of human life, is refolding, returning to the one, returning to the center, finding the unity in your own self-differentiation. So you're going from the center to the periphery, then the periphery back to the center, which one does in the paneurythmy of Peter Dunoff in the Sunbeams, which is part 2, We go from forgetfulness and ignorance to remembering, aletheia and wisdom. Aletheia means to, the lethe is to forget, so to unforget, as it were, is aletheia, which is that deep knowledge in the Greek tradition. From sleep to awakening, from darkness to light, from the descent to the ascent, from lead, this is a transformational process, to gold, from the self to the universal self, the individual to the universal divine self, and from unconscious unity to conscious oneness. So that's how I see the cosmic game, and something that obviously we can talk about, and Tim may have more to say about this. And then along with this, the Gnostics, and this also applies to some of the medieval heretics, they distinguish between these three levels of identity. The Hylics, from highly in matter, people who are identified with the body, and we now call these materialists or physicalists. Then the Psychics, which has nothing to do with psychic, it's to do with the psyche, which is representative of water, the animating principle, and Pistis, which is faith, which is taking things on trust. They see themselves as a part of the whole, and this is the level of the soul. The psyche is the soul. And then Pneumatics, from pneuma, which is breath, which represents true gnosis and corresponds to light and fire. They know they are the whole. They know that we know that we are the universal mind, and this is the level of the spirit. So the argument here, and this is an argument from the Galileo Commission, and which Harold Wallach specifically talks about, is that gnosis, and this is my thesis, if you like, gives us access to deeper structures of reality. And April DeConnick, who spoke for us a few weeks ago, she said that our essential human self or spirit is nothing less than God's own very life essence, waiting to be reawakened through gnosis. And she argued in her book and also her presentation that gnosis is transgressive and countercultural. And I think we are part of that in the network. We are somewhat transgressive in terms of respectability and acceptability, and countercultural, but maybe also the leading edge of culture. I like to think that's what Fritjof Capra argued in his book 40 years ago called The Turning Point. Then we come to Jung's Red Book, and Jung's huge influence on Peter Kingsley as well. And if you look at the first part of the Red Book, he talks about the spirit of this time as compared with the spirit of the depths. So the spirit of this time, which is also the spirit of our time, would like to hear of use and value. It's utilitarian, it's instrumental. But that other spirit forces me nevertheless to speak beyond justification, use, and meaning. So this is the depth, speaking out of the depth. And he explains that this experience of descending into his psyche took away his belief in science, forcing him down to the last and simplest things, and placed his understanding and knowledge at the service of the inexplicable and the paradoxical, the melting together of sense and nonsense, which produces the supreme meaning. It would take quite a long time to unpack that phrase, but I think it's to do with accessing the non-dual, accessing what is beyond polarities, and accessing an integrated view, which is also gnosis. And Jung was one of the great people who revived an interest in gnosis and Gnosticism. And Jung says the spirit of the time is really blind to what really matters, preferring to live on the surface rather than plumbing the depths, and seeking out what is rational, reasonable, and therefore comfortable and respectable. And we are, as I said a moment ago, we are on the frontiers of what is comfortable and respectable. And all innovators, they go beyond what people already think. And in this sense, I distinguish between the spirit and the letter, or the spirit and the law. So people who are rationalists only tend to use rather dismissive language. So a mystic or a Gnostic, a prophet, is a heretic, and someone who's on the fringe, who's a woo-woo, and represents woo-woo. Well, knowing, this knowing word comes from Ninian Smart, and he gave some Gifford lectures in Edinburgh when I was there in 1979, which was subsequently published. And he said, we have knowledge and knowledge. And knowledge is this deeper sense of gnosis, hence the G at the beginning. It's not a typo. And Peter Kingsley says it's the existence of a transcendental reality is indeed self-evident, that the world inside and outside rests on a transcendental background, is as certain as our own existence. Obviously, that he's making that statement from his own point of view. And it's one with which I agree, and which I think is also centrally important. And the problem is that gnosis was translated into institutional dogma. And he writes, the spirit and fire of the church had to vanish, be stamped out. So the birth of the church is a second crucifixion and death. That's an incredible thing to say. And after that, the only way the Spirit of Christ could stay alive was inside the heart of a few hidden heretics and mystics. And these were the people who were persecuted, the people who were burnt at the stake, the witches, the Albigensians, the Cathars down here, Marguerite of Porret, who was burnt in 1200. These are people who insisted on their own authority, their own experience, rather than just obedience to the institution. Then the story of the Jung Institute. Jung's idea was to have an interdisciplinary research institute where scholars could come together and share deeper insights, a little bit like Erenos, which we were talking about recently, where he used to meet with some of the great scholars of the time. And they spent 12 days together talking and also using eventually the I Ching. This was Shantina Sabatini and his weekend a couple of weekends ago. And anyway, the story of the Jung Institute is that once it had been set up, the people who were leading it said that Jung didn't understand what the Jung Institute was meant to be about, which is about training Jungians. And he explicitly said at the beginning that it shouldn't be about training Jungians. So that's what happens. And you may know that Jung said famously, "Thank God I'm not a Jungian." And Jung explains that what is primordially ancient is actually new, and we actually need to give birth to the old in a new time. Albert Schweitzer said something very similar. The task is to give birth to the old, or the primordial, the perennial, in a new time. In other words, to give expression to the spirit. The letter encloses a spirit. The spirit is one of prophecy. And this is what we need to embody individually and as a movement. And so Kingsley writes here that without prophets willing to take us back to the primordial reality of what we are, we have no future left. And I put C.F. Attenborough here. I don't know how many of you watched I'm reading his book as well, but watched his witness statement on Netflix. If you haven't and you do have Netflix, then put it down for Sunday evening, or at least for next week. And it's not, he uses a different language, but he really shares the view of the indigenous people that we need to find a way back to living sustainably within the limits of the planet, even if we have what's also called sustainable intensification to produce enough food. So I feel that this is where we are as a culture. We're cut off from our ancestors, we're cut off from our roots, we're cut off from the center, cut off from the sacred, cut off from our deepest identity. And we urgently need to return to this source. And this is something that this meaning, this search for meaning, which Viktor Frankl talked about. And so this process is one of moving from the small self to the large self, from the personal to the impersonal and universal, so that we no longer live for ourselves and become a source of life for others. And this is what Paul meant when he said, St. Paul, Christ in me. And Simone Weil, I mentioned her yesterday in my summing up. This is an essay on human personality, which is in a series of essays I reviewed earlier in the year. And she identifies the impersonal, I think we'd now say the transpersonal, because the word transpersonal didn't exist in her time in the 1930s and 40s, as the sacred, as the realm of truth and beauty. And I went to see some letters that she'd written to a famous Cathar scholar, whom she was corresponding with in the early 1940s. And I read this phrase in one of her letters. It says that modern thought, modern science, modern philosophy provides us with une nourriture spirituelle insuffisante, an inadequate spiritual nourishment. And I very much feel that. And part of what we're about here in the network is providing some of that spiritual, intellectual, cultural nourishment which we all need. And so I hope you're enjoying that in our program. Then I went back to Jung's book Ion, which is subtitled Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self. And this is an extraordinary book on gnosis and Gnosticism. And he talks about the God image here. And he writes that the God image is immediately related to or identical with the self. And everything that happens to the God image has an effect on the latter. Any uncertainty about the God images causes a profound uneasiness in the self and destroys the continuity of historical tradition, which is the hallmark of civilization. So the destruction of the God image, he writes, is followed by the annulment of human personality. And so this is the loss of the center, which B. Griffiths also wrote about. It's the loss of our roots. It's the loss of that sense of something more transcendent in which we are truly rooted and which constitutes our fundamental identity. So I think this is a very interesting message for our time. And of course, he wrote it nearly 100 years ago. And many of you will be familiar with these lines from William Butler Yeats's Second Coming: things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. And this takes on a new meaning, looking at what's happening in the US, particularly at the moment, this mere anarchy being loosed upon the world. And then information is not enough. We need knowledge, we need wisdom, we need meaning. T.S. Eliot talks in his 4 quartets about a condition of complete simplicity costing not less than everything. And many of you on the call will know exactly what he means. And in another chorus from The Rock, he says, where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? And in fact, another line from 4 quartets, Michelle Robinson's on the call, and we used the 4 quartets last year on a walk we did on the sacred Sentier Cathar, the Cathar path. And so we read through it in the course of a few days and talked about these wonderful lines. If any of you don't know the 4 quartets, then goodness, you should order it after this talk. Some of the greatest poetry, well, some of the greatest poetry of the 20th century. And he also said that we were distracted by distraction from distraction. So he was writing about distraction in the 1930s, and goodness, he'd seen what's happening now, and he would realize how prophetic he'd been. And then we come back to Peter Kingsley, that it's only by shedding everything, including ourselves, that we sow the seeds of the future. I think this is something that I feel at my stage of life. I'm at a shedding stage in my life, as many of you are. So we have to shed a lot of the past. We have to shed the shadow. We have to shed things that we don't really need anymore in order to sort of clear the clutter and enable the new to come in. And that also means listening to dreams and noticing synchronicities. I was talking to Apila Colorado this week, and she was referring to the dream work they were doing in the Chartres Academy. Obviously, they weren't able to meet in Chartres. And we have Jim Garrison from Ubiquity University coming up in our program shortly. And so the dreams from this group are urgent. The dreams say we need to transform ourselves urgently. There's no time left. Now coming back to the levels of knowing, and this is obviously also relevant to the Galileo Commission. I find this very helpful, that this distinction made by Saint Bonaventure when he talks about the 3 eyes or the 3 lenses. So the eye of sense is the one that we're all very familiar with immediately. The eye of reason is the eye for mathematics and logic and analysis, which is Dionaya. And the eye of contemplation is what was traditionally known as the intellect. The intellect now has been equated with reason, which it isn't. The intellect, for me, is the capacity to know by identity, to know oneness through gnosis, through nous. So the eye of contemplation is non-dual. And as we've been saying earlier on in this talk, the church, philosophy, psychology, and science, they downgrade this inner knowing and gnosis. And they put the emphasis on the senses and reason. And the whole argument here is that that gnosis and contemplation and the insights from these states give us an important clue about the nature of reality, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And so we're left hemisphere dominated, only looking through these lenses 2 and 3. And the observer, the knower, the subject consciousness actually excluded from the picture, as you'll see, I think, in the next slide. And this is a phrase from Peter Kingsley. We've suffered from metaphysical amputation with the suppression of gnosis in favor of belief, and now in favor of unbelief. So here's Schrödinger and Planck. And this quote from Schrödinger comes from a brilliant essay that I reviewed in April last year from a book called Nature and the Greeks. I cut out my mind when I construct the real world around me. I'm not aware of this cutting out. And then I'm very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. Gives us a lot of factual information, puts all of our experience into a magnificently consistent order, but it is ghastly silent about all and sundry that is really near to our heart and that really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, the qualia, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. And so this is the quantitative approach, and which can't give you an insight into quality. And here's the famous quote from Planck that we use on our program. It's only a part of it, because I've cut the rest of it out. And Ian referred to this yesterday. I regard consciousness as fundamental. Matter is derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. And these are 2 Nobel Prize winning physicists, again, as Ian was talking about, the physicists who really understood this way of knowing beyond reason and the fundamental nature of consciousness. So I think there are 2 ways of approaching this. You can either have consciousness within science, or science within consciousness. So the first is a third-person perspective, which says the brain gives rise to the mind, matter is primary, we can measure the neural correlates, that this is a quantitative approach, and it's an approach which says that the brain produces or emits consciousness. Again, Ian talked about this yesterday. So the first person perspective, on the other hand, is science within consciousness, where mind, in a sense, gives rise to matter, or certainly our perception of it in a phenomenal sense. And so there's the primacy of mind and a primacy of quality and qualia. And this is something, again, which many of our speakers talk about, which is the possible transition between what William James called the model of the emissive model, that the brain produces consciousness, to one where the brain is a form of transmission or a transmitter of consciousness. And I think you'll hear more about that from Ed Kelly this afternoon, because this is all explained in great detail in their books, Irreducible Mind, and then particularly Beyond Physicalism, which is more recent. And then next year, we're hoping to have a launch event for Consciousness Unbound, which is the 3rd volume, again, edited by Ed and some other colleagues, many of whom are network members. So I see these trends here in the last 100 years or so, an interest in mysticism. Evelyn Underhill's book was published in 1911. The work of Sir Alister Hardy, near-death experiences since the 1970s, parapsychology, humanistic and transpersonal psychology, the huge resurgence in interest in non-duality and mindfulness, which we heard about from Tamara Russell, and then the significance of the discovery of the Gnostic Gospels at Nag Hammadi and other Gospels like the Gospel of Mary. And then, so for me, near-death experiences, near-death and mystical experiences is a form of gnosis and initiation into this deeper structure of reality. And it's one where light and love, mind and heart are unified, as you'll see from some examples in a second. So this goes from information to transformation, metanoia, which is beyond the mind. And it invites us, as the Delphic oracle said, to know thyself, and thou shalt know the universe. So here are a couple of examples from near-death experiences. That's what people say. I just found myself in this extremely bright light and felt absolute peace. I feel the light and the peace are one. I had no sense of separate identity. I was in the light and one with it. So this is a non-dual Gnostic experience of gnosis. Another one, I came into the arc of pure golden love and light. This radiation of love entered me, and instantly I was part of it and it was part of me. Third example, these are all separate experiences. As I became one with this omnipresent light, its knowledge became my knowledge. Make a note of that, because I'm going to come back to this when I have a slide about Walter Russell. And those of you who were online for the Jeff Kripal presentation a few weeks ago may remember he talked about the bars, the 3 bars. Do these experiences happen at all? Is the first bar. Are they significant for mind and consciousness? Second bar. And do they have implications for the nature of reality? Third bar. Well, I go with the third view, and it's really why we are putting on these Beyond the Brain conferences, because what we're trying to do, as I said yesterday in my introductory talk, is to expand the evidence base of a science of consciousness, to expand the evidence base of a science of consciousness, and to invite people to look through the telescope at what they haven't looked through up until now. Now, here's Walter Russell. Those of you who've heard previous talks of mine will know about Walter Russell, and I can't say very much about him here, not to be confused with Bertrand Russell, who was almost exact contemporary, 1872 to 1970. Now, here is his extraordinary sculpture of Mark Twain. And the story about his sculpting is that he had never done any sculpting until his mid-50s. And his first subject was Edison. And so he was sort of driving down to Edison to do the first sitting. And he produced great work, even though he'd never done anything like this before. But he trusted in his own genius. That was the thing about Russell. And here he says, and this is from the Man Who Tapped the Secrets of the Universe by Glenn Clark. This is a short biography of Russell, which I highly recommend. We'll put this in the resources to follow up when we do the recordings. He writes, all knowledge exists in the mind universe of light. Notice light here, which is God. All mind is one mind. We do not have separate minds. And I think this is what we're beginning to appreciate. All knowledge can be obtained from the universal source of all knowledge by becoming one with that source. So this is knowledge by identity. Cosmic consciousness is the goal of human development, whereby we as individuals become aware of our oneness with the universal mind and can manifest genius. And he said, genius is self-bestowed and mediocrity is, is self-imposed. So that's a thought. And his book, his major book was called The Universal One. And a number of years ago, I reviewed his book and the biography of him, a book called The Secret of Light. So if you're interested in this, then I would start with the extraordinary short biography by Glenn Clark. Then Huxley, in The Perennial Philosophy, Aldous Huxley wrote, knowledge is a function of being. So when there's a change in the being of the knower, there's a corresponding change in the nature and the amount of knowing. So this is moving from the eye of sense and the eye of reason to the eye of contemplation, which represents a change in the function of being. And then I think what Eckhart expresses in this is a reciprocity, which is, I think, one of the ultimate insights for human life. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me, or even sees in me. So there's no separation there. And then this is another book which I recommend if you haven't come across it. And I think Tuvie Orbach is on the call, and he's very keen on Charles Harnell, the Master Key System. There's one principle of consciousness pervading the entire universe. As this consciousness is omnipresent, it must be present within every individual. Each individual must be a manifestation of that omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent consciousness. Your consciousness and my consciousness is therefore identical with the universal consciousness. All mind is one mind, so that's what Walter Russell just stated. Each individual is the individualization of the universal, the cosmic mind. So this really tells us the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm. So that if there is consciousness and there is an ultimate transcendent source of this consciousness, and this may be a discussion that we can have with Tim Freke, and I'm going to come on to Tim's work in a second. In fact, right now, Tim wrote a couple of books about 20 years ago with Peter Gandy, and one of them is called Jesus and the Lost Goddess. And I'm hoping to review these, in fact, in the next issue. And he points out that, or this is one of my takes on it, that fundamentalism and literalism is also present within science. But interestingly, that gnosis and science both posit the freedom to question. So so science wants to question authority, question the consensus, question what's going on in a particular field. And both the Gnostic and the scientist etymologically means knower. And so there is this quest for truth. And I think in the gnosis sense, an exploration of inner space, not outer space, and bringing self-knowledge, and you'll see that's written with a capital, not with a small, not just self-knowledge, but self-knowledge. And then, and I think this is, I'm pretty sure this is a quote from them. I'm afraid I haven't got the reference. Realized Gnostics know that the knower and the known are one. They are the mystery of God manifesting it as all that is. There's no self and other, no subject and object, all is one. With the realization of gnosis, we find ourselves no longer separate from others, or indeed from anything, but at one in the mystery with all that is. We dissolve into mystical communion. We are in love with all beings. Having said that, I think building on what Ian McGilchrist said yesterday, I think we need to be able to move between these points, to move between the individual and the universal, but to realize in our lives that we are in fact embedded in the universal and therefore intrinsically related to everyone else. Then just a little more about the scholars on gnosis. This is Giovanni Filoramo, who's wrote a book on gnosis, and then Elaine Pagels, whose famous book, 1979, The Gnostic Gospel. I'm sure many of you have got that. So Filoramo, he writes, the Gnostic knowledge is a lived experience of spiritual regeneration. It's a knowledge of the beginning and the end. To know means to become the same reality that is known, removing the dichotomy between subject and object. So you can see where this is going, that this eye of contemplation, that gnosis is another level of insight, which I think needs to be incorporated in a future science of consciousness. And this is indeed what is recommended in the Galileo Commission report. So as I said before, the emphasis is on experience, not on doctrine. And it then gives you experiential knowing. You don't need to be told what to believe. You know from your own experience. And the problem about this in terms of authority is it provides justification for not obeying priests and bishops. And this also applied to the Cathars. I'm speaking from the Cathar country down here. So Pagel said something very similar to April de Konik, that gnosis is self-knowledge and knowledge of the self, capital S. So to know oneself at the deepest level is simultaneous to know God, and to know that we are actually that divine essence expressing itself in differentiated form. And this I found very interesting, this technique in gnosis and Gnosticism, which April de Konik writes about in her book that she was talking about a few weeks ago. This is silence, both the primal state of the ineffable God they seek and a bodily practice in which they engage to withdraw into this primal state as they return to the source of life. The primal God in Gnostic myths is a silent God, and the goal of the Gnostic journey is to withdraw back into this original silence, rest, and stillness. Silence is considered the state of utter transcendence, the very essence of ultimate reality in its original condition. So the living silence is a state of silent light. So again, you have light there, light and silence. And what surprised me when I was reading this book was that the author made no connection with meditation, because this more or less describes a technique of meditation, even though the word was not used. It was called incubation, although there's more to incubation than just sitting in silence. And so coming back to the process that I think we're undergoing at the moment is moving to a new position in a science of consciousness. These are a few insights which some of you may already have had from Jeff Kripal, but it might be helpful for those who aren't familiar with Jeff's work. So he argues that science is half right, but on the outer. It's only one aspect. There are what Marilyn Monk, who's on the call, would call the mystic and the poet, and as the scientist is part of it. And then these other identities require other models and approaches. So the flip, as he describes it, is from an outside to an inside perspective, from object to subject, from third to first person, and in some ways from personal to universal. And he describes a number of scientists and philosophers who had this flip, and the complete revolution it represented in their understanding of reality. So these experiences, impossible experiences, he calls them, are can you really just dismiss them as anecdotes or coincidences? And so he writes paradoxically and ironically here, these things that happen all the time cannot happen at all. And in fact, Mark Twain was an example he gave, and I just showed you the sculpture of the precognition of his brother's death, which is incredibly vivid and well documented case, which you can look up. So the encounter is one of gnosis. Has to be beyond linear thought and language and belief. And what we need is not a crucial experiment, but rather a crucial experience. This is what transforms us, are the crucial experiences we have in life. And he concludes that the mind is the locus of all scientific practice and knowledge. And so that needs to be recognized within the humanities. And he defines the humanities as the study of consciousness within culture. And he also argues, this is something we're hoping to develop, he also argues that we need to be working within the humanities now to enlarge the picture of what a human being is. And so this question of what exactly is a human being, what is the nature of human consciousness, what's the nature of reality, these are very important questions, crucial questions for our time. And he continues that our conclusions are really a function of our exclusions. And then I said this yesterday, dismissed and therefore missed. And these are quotes from Kripal, that materialism rigorously leaves out everything it cannot explain, which is not looking through the telescope. And he talks about the dominance of the production model and the suppression of the transmission model, which we've been referring to throughout this talk. And the fact that many of you will be familiar with this order of knowledge is disciplined and policed. And so if you step outside the box or step outside the orthodox, then you're ignored or dismissed or compromised, or you lose your career prospects, what Max Wellman's calls a career limiting move, and you might not get any research grants. And so there's a huge pressure to remain within this order of knowledge. And one of the things that we stand for, as it were, within the Galileo Commission is the freedom of young academics to pursue the kind of research projects that they're passionate about, and not find that they simply can't research things because they're outside the box. And there is a sort of emotional component to this as well. So the reactions to Daryl Bem and to Thomas Nagel are vitriolic, they're emotional. And so it's a heresy to challenge the existing worldview. So you've got political questions of power and authority that come in here, which are important to be aware of. And he concludes that if the mind isn't a radio, then the impossible becomes possible, indeed predictable. And this is what we mean by widening the evidence base of a science of consciousness. We want to be evidence-based. We want to look rigorously and compare and analyze different explanations, different approaches, but it does mean that you need to engage with the evidence. So he talks about the study of consciousness within culture as being the purpose of the humanities, and accessing the deep strata of reality. And I think scholars like Jung and Peter Kingsley and Jeremy Nadler, whose book, The Struggle for a Human Future, I'm just reviewing at the moment, and I'm going to be talking about this book in my book briefing next week. And also the perspective, the participatory perspective, elaborated by Bernardo Kastrup and his idealism, and Richard Tarnas in his Passion of the Western Mind, this participatory view that we are the universe, the human imagination is the universe becoming self-aware. And so we need to take these things seriously, because in my view, Jeff Kripal shares this, that these unique experiences are not amenable to the scientific method. And I advocate a more kind of legal approach to looking rigorously at case histories and making sure that they are as they seem to be. And getting beyond this idea that anything that doesn't already fit into the box must be unreal or unimportant, or in terms of skepticism about parapsychology, even fraudulent. So what I think we're moving towards here is a vision of a conscious cosmos. And so that there is a meaning that is sparked between objective events and our subjective states. And symbols and symbolic literacy, I think, is very important here, because the symbols are between things. Symballine in Greek means to throw together. Diabolon means to throw apart. So symbols bring things together, whereas the diabolical, the dualistic, takes things and prizes things apart. So what I think we're looking for here, which also applies to the network approach, is a both and view rather than either or. A view that incorporates right and left hemisphere, yin and yang, in a similar way to Ian McGilchrist's work, and that our reality, and this is another argument from Jeff Kripal, that dreams and reality live on an imaginative spectrum. They're all part of the same spectrum, and that's what we need. That's why we need to pay attention to how life is unfolding for us and to be in resonance with it. So in this deeper understanding, the inner and the outer, the subjective and objective, are not sharply distinguished in this state of gnosis, this knowledge by identity, which also underpins Goethean science, and bringing contemplation into the picture. So I'm just coming to the end now. So I think we are in a depth of evolutionary crisis and challenge, and which has spiritual, ecological, social, political, and economic aspects. And there is huge pressure within the system, and resistance, and clamping down. And there's an impulse to freedom, I understand, represented by Mars, and an impulse to control, represented by Saturn. And so we're at a point of huge tension, where the breakdown could become a breakthrough. But we can't lose hope. We must have a vision of the kind of world we'd like to co-create together. But it is one, in my view, and this is shared by Irving Laszlo and many other thinkers, that we have to transform as a society and as in our systems, or there's a danger of us extinguishing ourselves. Martin Rees says the same thing. So my position here is that the realization of gnosis is the realization of the oneness of life and consciousness, that we are one another. And that has ethical implications for a planetary ethic of care and interconnectedness. And it brings head and heart together and encourages us to take love seriously as a principle. This would be a whole other lecture. I don't think we take love as a principle seriously. And until love becomes more predominant than power, and we seek love and connection more than we seek power, we're going to continue to have the similar problems to what we have already. This is my book that's coming out next year, not this cover probably, or that's a Chartres Labyrinth, A Quest for Wisdom, Inspiring Purpose on the Path of Life. And there's a few websites. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll try and escape, right, and go back to stop share.
Well, that's great, David. Thank you so much.